What's up, guys? So I'm gonna try doing a thing today that I have never done before, but I've wanted to do for a really long time, which is basically take some articles that I really love and think are great, amazing articles that everyone should read and be aware of, and kind of do a close reading of them. The idea being that not just reading the article, but also that when something comes up that I want to look into a little bit more or get some background on, anything like that, that we stop and go and actually look up the thing and do a little bit of research into it and get a really rich understanding of what is, again, I consider to be a great article. So like I said, I've never done this before. I'm not quite sure how it's gonna go or what exactly I'm trying to do with it. I will say, my sort of higher level goals are number one, to kind of get back into the habit of being a performer. I've been building this website for the last couple months. I haven't been, doing a show regularly, and I think it'll be easier to kind of off the air practice that sort of thing, as well as start working with, the new website and getting used to kind of reading and researching things and taking notes on the website at the same time, which is, I think, going to be a big part of the future show. And then also to kind of use the articles and the stuff I talk about in context in relation to them as a way of starting to build a base of knowledge around the world and how it works and all that sort of stuff. And sort of enter them into the record for the new site. Because one of the things I'm really excited about with the way this new site works is that, we have basically, I'm calling them contexts, little, they're basically tags attached to each topic that, can have all the related posts on that topic. And I want to be able to, oh shit. It's really hard to get to new posts. Hold on, there we go. Okay, yeah. Anyways, sorry. Basically, I want to, start adding to a lot of the different narratives and contexts and things that we're going to be talking about with these great articles that I love and have read in the past, and then taking notes on them so that, this article we're going to read today is about unions, and I'll explain a little bit more in just a second. But the next time unions come up and someone's like, oh, well, why are unions all that important in the first place? Click on the unions tag, and then we get, oh yeah, this article, and we pull up this article and all the notes that I'm about to take on it, and can sort of really quickly hit oh, right, this is why unions are so important. So it's, in large part about starting to build up that background context for all the topics we're going to be talking about on the show to come. So that's enough of an intro. Let's get into it with a second intro now for the article that we're actually going to be talking about. So this article is called All Worked Up and Nowhere to Go by Amber Ali Frost, who you may know is one of the co-hosts, the least often co-host of Chapo Trap House, the Dirtbag Left podcast. I believe Amber actually coined the term the Dirtbag Left, although I could totally be wrong about that. I think I just remember reading that somewhere recently. Anyways, this article here is, in my mind, in my history of my own thinking, kind of kicked off the kind of modern era that I'm currently in, that is very largely based around unions as the savior of not just the working class, but politics generally, and in creating a balance between the sort of super powerful elite that actually run things and the everyone else who should have some say but doesn't. And I think this article does a really, really great job of getting at the but doesn't part of why the sort of the I don't even want, I mean, it is the working class. I just hate using such a abused term that has been put through the ringer in so many different ways to mean so many different things. But basically, how the people generally can actually wield power on a scale commensurate with billionaires and CEOs and the sort of elite class. So without any further ado, let's get into All Worked Up and Nowhere to Go by Amber Ali Frost. And again, I'm going to try to, sort of take notes on it and pop back over to this tab over here. We'll see how that goes. I have this sense that I'm going to fail miserably at taking the notes. I'm just going to kind of read the thing at the end and be like, all right, I was going to take notes. Again, that's one of the things I want to practice with doing these videos is sort of taking notes as I'm processing information and talking to you guys. So, all right, here we are. It is from June 2017, which is, it's a pretty enmeshed in the context of its time. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that was going on in June 2017, but just kind of keep that in mind. We are 6 months into the Trump presidency, or 5 months really at this point. I don't know if it's beginning of June or end of June, but 5 or 6 months into the Trump presidency. It's now 2 years and some change old. So, you know, cast your mind back to the halcyon days of June 2017, and let's get started here. I did not anticipate how the death of the radical British writer and theorist Mark Fisher would haunt me, but I am reminded of him more and more often, and I find myself returning to his work regularly. And it's not just me. Recently, a magazine editor asked if I would co-write an autopsy of contemporary radical activism. We both felt a post-mortem was needed before a reanimated left could emerge to fight capital and seize power. We could be like Mark Fisher, he said excitedly. We could tell the hard truths. I had to remind him not only that neither of us is half as smart as Fisher, but that the hard truths essay the editor was referring to got Fisher crucified by his peers, and that Mark Fisher had recently committed suicide. So, all right, obviously, first thing we gotta do is figure out who this Mark Fisher character is. I remember, like in some previous reading of this article, I've looked into him, and she's gonna reference in the next paragraph this exiting the vampire castle essay. So there's hard truths and exiting the vampire castle seem to be the two that are most relevant here. But who is this guy, Mark Fisher? He is a theorist, according to Wikipedia, known for his blog called K-Punk, a British writer, critic, cultural theorist, philosopher, and teacher based in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths University of London. He initially achieved acclaim for his blogging as K-Punk in the early 2000s and was known for his writing on radical politics, music, and popular culture. Kind of curious where that like K-Punk name came from, or what it mean. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with his. It's interesting to me that this guy who we were just talking about being revered as a teller of hard truths also writes under something of a pseudonym. I don't know if he was actually pseudonymous, or if that's just a name that he like, you know, a nom de guerre of sorts that he like published under, even though everyone knew who he was. Published several books, including The Unexpected Success, Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative, and contributed to publications such as The Wire, Fact, New Statesman, and Sight and Sound. Co-founder of Zero Books and later Repeater Books, died in January 2017, shortly before the publication of The Weird and the Eerie. So they say died. She just said killed himself. I'm not going to go too deep into his whole background. It doesn't seem too important. I do, however, want to look up these two essays she's sort of referencing here and see what they are all about. So it doesn't seem like there's actually a hard truths. It was hard truths, right? That was the thing? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we've got this, like, literally Mark Fisher hard truths. The third result is the article we're talking about today. I guess, I don't know. I mean, it seems like this capitalist realism, this is just his book, though, right? Yeah, it is a book right here. I mean, it's only 70 pages, so okay. But what about exiting the vampire castle? Because that, I remember actually, I think that is just an essay, and I kind of want to either get a summary of it. I feel like capitalist realism, is there no alternative? I don't think we need to dive into that one, right? I feel like it's pretty obvious what he's going to be saying there. It might be very much worth reading, you know, because I'm sure it's very insightful and good, but I think we can pretty much say we know what's going on there. But exiting the vampire castle. Yeah. This is the actual essay by Mark Fisher. Yeah, how long is this thing? It's a little long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let's just read the sort of header and maybe the intro here just to get a sense of his argument and what she's talking about. Again, in the next paragraph. We need to learn or relearn how to build comradeship and solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. This doesn't mean, of course, that we must always agree. On the contrary, we must create conditions where disagreement can take place without fear of exclusion and excommunication. Okay, so yeah, so it seems to be basically there's this idea of leftist infighting, right? Where the populist groups that are all about building comradeship and a like broad base of people coming together and supporting each other have this tendency to eat their young and rip each other apart from the inside and just be absolutely terrible at actually bringing people together. And I think that's kind of what he's talking about here. But let's do a little actual reading of it. This summer, I seriously considered withdrawing from any involvement in politics. Exhausted through overwork, incapable of productive activity, I found myself drifting through social networks, feeling my depression and exhaustion increasing. Oh, this guy's gonna, okay, no, he's got like 3 years till he kills himself. He's got 3 years and 3 months before he kills himself, so it's not quite that depressing of a start here. Left-wing Twitter can often be a miserable, dispiriting zone. And again, let's put this in context, 2013. So this is after the Obama-Romney. This is right after the Obama-Romney election. Oh no, a year after the Obama-Romney election. The middle of the Obama era. Twitter is like 5 years old at this point. I think 2012 was the first election where Twitter was like a thing, and it wasn't like a big thing. But that's kind of, we're in the early days of Twitter here. Earlier this year, there were some high-profile Twitter storms in which particular left-identifying figures were called out and condemned. What these figures had said was sometimes objectionable, but nevertheless, the way in which they were personally vilified and hounded left a horrible residue, the stench of bad conscience and witch-hunting moralism. The reason I didn't speak out on any of these incidents, I'm ashamed to say, was fear. The bullies were in another part of the playground. I didn't want to attract their attention to me. The open savagery of these exchanges was accompanied by something more pervasive, and for that reason, perhaps more debilitating, an atmosphere of snarky resentment. The most frequent object of this resentment is Owen Jones, and the attacks on Jones, the person most responsible for raising class consciousness in the UK in the last few years, and let's avoid the Ouroboros rabbit hole of now going down and looking up who Owen Jones is, then reading Owen Jones essays, and then he'll reference a guy, and we'll just like keep going down the path forever. Let's just say I think, yeah, that seems like a good enough summary of who Owen Jones is for me. He's a very visible British leftist, I guess, were one of the reasons I was so dejected. If this is what happens to a left-winger who is actually succeeding in taking the struggle to the center ground of British life, why would anyone want to follow him into the mainstream? Is the only way to avoid this drip feed of abuse to remain in a position of impotent marginality? How far does he go before he references Vampire Castle? A long time. Okay. So I was thinking I kind of wanted to read until he explained the Vampire Castle metaphor, but maybe I'll just read a couple more paragraphs and then figure out where he says that. One of the things that broke me out of this depressive stupor was going to the People's Assembly in Ipswich, near where I live. The People's Assembly had been greeted with the usual sneers and snarks. This was, we were told, a useless stunt, in which media leftists, including Jones, were aggrandizing themselves in yet another display of top-down celebrity culture. What actually happened at the Assembly in Ipswich was very different to this caricature. The first half of the evening, culminating in a rousing speech by Owen Jones, was certainly led by the top table speakers. The first half of the evening was certainly led by the top table speakers, but the second half of the meeting saw working class activists from all over Suffolk talking to each other, supporting one another, sharing experiences and strategies. Far from being another example of hierarchical leftism, the People's Assembly was an example of how the vertical can be combined with the horizontal. Media power and charisma could draw people who hadn't previously been to a political meeting into the room where they could talk and strategize with seasoned activists. The atmosphere was anti-racist and anti-sexist, but refreshingly free of the paralyzing feeling of guilt and suspicion which hangs over left-wing Twitter like an acrid, stifling fog. Alright. Yeah, let's just not go into the whole thing about Russell Brand, and let's just figure out what the Vampire Castle... Because, yeah, I mean, it seems like that's exactly... The point I was saying is exactly what he's talking about, is sort of the need to actually build alliances and find comradeship on the left, as opposed to just sort of like, purity tests and competing to be the most like extreme leftist you can possibly be, and just like totally, turning into a persona non grata anyone who's just a shade left of your ideal left philosophy. Okay, so I guess we need to read it. It says the first configuration is what I came to call the vampire castle. So let's just read the paragraph before this. Where to go from here? It is first of all necessary to identify the features of the discourse and the desires which have led us to this grim and demoralizing pass, where class has disappeared, but moralism is everywhere, where solidarity is impossible, but guilt and fear are omnipresent. And not because we are terrorized by the right, but because we have allowed bourgeois modes of subjectivity to contaminate our movement. Bourgeois modes of subjectivity. Okay. Bourgeois modes of subjectivity. I mean, I feel like that's kind of what I was talking about, like the sort of, competitive leftist extremism. But to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what he means by that sentence there. But, I mean, yeah, it's probably kind of the stuff he's talking. I should have just read these paragraphs. Anyways, I think there are two libidinal discursive configurations which have brought this situation about. They call themselves left-wing, but, as the Brand episode has made clear, they are in many ways a sign that the left, defined as an agent in a class struggle, has all but disappeared. Okay, so the first configuration is what I came to call the vampire's castle. The vampire's castle specializes in propagating guilt. It is driven by a priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, an academic pedant's desire to be the first to be seen to spot a mistake, and a hipster's desire to be one of the in crowd. Okay, so we've got the priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn. That's sort of, what everyone's calling cancel culture these days. An academic pedant's desire to be the first to be seen to spot a mistake. So that's just sort of, viciously looking for any little, slip up to jump on. And a hipster's desire to be one of the in crowds. We're talking about the sort of forming an exclusive movement that can make you feel superior to everyone else because you're on the vanguard and you're cool and one of the in crowd. So that's what he's referring to as the vampire castle, is this sort of culture of guilt driven by those three desires. And the danger in attacking the vampire's castle is that it can look as if, and it will do everything it can to reinforce this thought, that one is also attacking the struggles against racism, sexism, heterosexism. But, far from being the only legitimate expression of such struggles, the vampire's castle is best understood as a bourgeois liberal perversion and appropriation of the energy of these movements. The vampire's castle was born the moment when the struggle not to be defined by identitarian categories became the quest to have identities recognized by a bourgeois big other. Okay, so yeah. So he's talking about the vampire's castle was born the moment when the struggle not to be defined by identitarian categories became the quest to have identities recognized by a bourgeois big other. So this is when people talk about representation and things like that. So, kind of I guess what he's saying here is that the early days, not the early days, but the sort of just pre-modern days of progressivism were very much defined by so what if I'm gay? That doesn't define me. That's not who I am. Whereas these days, it does seem like there's more of a thing of well, you have to have a gay person, you have to have a, and that whole thing. And while obviously I don't mean to, I feel like it just sounded like I was criticizing the idea of representation matters. I'm not one of its major apostles, but I do think it's important, to have a sort of diverse set of stories and models being presented in media. But I think, he's right that struggle to have this diverse display of models presented within media has very much overtaken the sort of actual anti-race. It's sort of, there's this distinction between liberalism and radicalism that I go back to a lot, where liberalism is the belief that everything is basically fine. We need to just sort of keep making small incremental changes. And radicalism is the belief that it needs, the system is fucked. Basically, it's rotten and needs to be ripped out at the root. That's literally what where the phrase comes from, is to grasp at the root. And so a sort of like liberal civil rights, the liberal model of civil rights was we just need to, get black people into positions of power. We just need black, mayors and black people in Congress, and then everything will work itself out. Whereas the radicals say that, like, look, it's the system that's broken. Like, you can put black people in Congress, but they're just going to be responding to the same incentives that everyone else is, and they're going to have, the same issues. And even though they're black and not racist, they're going to keep perpetuating a system of racism because it is so deeply entrenched. And so there is more that needs to be done than just sort of, giving power to members of marginalized communities and, like representing them in media, that there is an actual system of, hetero white supremacy that needs to be systematically dismantled. And so what he seems to be talking about here is that, at some point, it seems like the radical struggle was consumed and sort of discarded by the liberal struggle. And what like sort of dominates liberal energy in so many parts of the world these days is not to sort of like move past gender, but to make sure we get, we have like women on panels talking about movies at Comic-Con or whatever. Not to, move like to just say like, oh, gay people are just like everybody else. To be like, okay, well, we need to have, like a show about gay people on NBC, or like homophobia will never go away. And I think I'm going to do another one of these videos down the road a little ways on I think it's Freddie DeBoer article called A Planet of Cops or something like that. I forget what it's called, but it's another of my favorite articles where he talks about basically exactly what I was just talking about. So I'm not going to go into too much more into detail on that. And then, yeah, again, this is not the article we're talking about. It does seem to be decently short, so I don't want to read, but still don't want to read the whole thing. I just want to... Let's just cut down to the last 3 paragraphs here and get his conclusion. The rejection of identitarianism can only be achieved by the reassertion of class. A left that does not have class at its core can only be a liberal pressure group. Class consciousness is always double. It involves a simultaneous knowledge of the way in which class frames and shapes all experience, and a knowledge of the particular position that we occupy in the class structure. So again, his point is class is not just about class. Class is also is an intersection with all the other different, identity factors. It must be remembered that the aim of our struggle is not recognition by the bourgeois, nor even the destruction of the bourgeois itself. It is the class structure, a structure that wounds everyone, even those who materially profit from it, that must be destroyed. The interests of the working class are the interests of all. The interests of the bourgeois are the interests of capital, which are the interests of no one. Our struggle must be towards the construction of a new and surprising world, not the preservation of identities shaped and distorted by capital. If this seems like a forbidding and daunting task, it is. But we can start to engage in many prefigurative activities right now. Actually, such activities would go beyond prefiguration. They could start a virtuous cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy in which bourgeois modes of subjectivity, there it is again, are dismantled and a new universality starts to build itself. I guess he's kind of talking about identity politics there. Bourgeois modes of subjectivity. I guess that's what that's about. But we need to learn or relearn how to build comradeship and solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. This doesn't mean, of course, that we must always agree. On the contrary, we must create conditions where disagreement can take place without fear of exclusion and excommunication. We need to think very strategically about how to use social media, always remembering that despite the egalitarianism claimed for social media by capital's libidinal engineers, that this is currently enemy territory, dedicated to the reproduction of capital. But this doesn't mean that we can't occupy the terrain and start to use it for the purposes of producing class consciousness. We must break out of the debate set up by communicative capitalism, in which capital is endlessly cajoling us to participate, and remember that we are involved in a class struggle. The goal is not to be an activist, but to aid the working class to activate and transform itself. Outside the vampire's castle, anything is possible. Okay, so that's exiting the vampire castle. And as we were saying, yeah, a sort of cry for left unity and, a movement focused more on class consciousness and sort of the unifying factors of the people broadly, as opposed to, identity politics and the dividing factors of the people broadly. So that is this article she's about to reference here, and a sort of quick look at who this Mark Fisher guy is that she's chosen to start the article with, which I think actually is pretty enlightening, honestly, given where we're going with this article, the reference to him that she makes here. So, although Fisher's work demonstrates a sprawling awareness of life deranged by capitalism, he is best remembered for the prescient, infamous essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, which infuriated much of the self-identified left by arguing that a shallow and noxious liberal identity critique, delivered mostly on the internet, was being used to undermine class politics and paralyze left discourse. I remember not thinking too much of his diagnosis at the time, which was late 2013, agreeing with some points but not buying in wholesale. Later, I realized it was spot on, a preview of the farcically doomed Clinton campaign, but by then Fisher had been... realized it was spot on, a preview of the farcically doomed Clinton campaign, but by then Fisher had been written off as a toxic white brocialist, a man doing violence to the most vulnerable people in the movement. Even worse, after Fisher died at 48 in January of this year, he was still being denounced by po-faced critics for his frankly gracious critique of the left. And I'm talking right after his death, within hours of the information going public. I've never heard this term po-faced before. Just want to really quickly find out what that means. Humorless and disapproving. Can we get like an etymology here? 1930s, perhaps from po, influenced by poker face. So po being, yeah, I mean, it's gotta be this one, sort of slang short for poor, used to represent dialectical speech. I mean, like po' boy, basically. Influenced by poker face. Interesting. Huh. Never heard that term before. Okay. Yeah. So, the Trump administration has rekindled the internal hysteria that Fisher warned against. And though it was heartening, the first wave of solidarity marches and general actions is now fading into memory. We're left with a familiar hostility, a recurring bad faith that so recently has smeared greater minds and gentler hearts than my own. The economic ambitions of the so-called Sanders effect appear to have waned, and the focus is predictably turned to the glittering, bilious spectacle of Trumpism. Just as Trump remade politics as television, we've allowed political action to mimic the spiteful, feudal patterns of online bickering. Our fellow anti-capitalists betray us all by enjoying or creating the wrong art. So yeah, sorry, this is the bickering here, right? Feudal patterns of online bickering. Our fellow anti-capitalists betray us all by enjoying or creating the wrong art, reading the wrong articles, championing the wrong theories, or even laughing at the wrong jokes. The left is at once flailing and sclerotic, afflicted by a vague autoimmune disorder. We cannot even retain what little power we have, nor do we have any institutions capable of doing so. Thus, we are able to smack only those within arm's reach of us, ourselves. We are only able to smack only those within arm's reach of us, ourselves. Yeah, let me just finish the paragraph here. Meanwhile, the bigger and stronger the right gets, the more insular we become. Single-mindedly obsessed with purifying our own ranks and weeding out the problematic among us. Of course, the left requires large portions of the problematic and disparate working class to sign on, but the range of acceptable comradely thinking is becoming ever stricter, and deviants are sacrificed to increase group solidarity, as the artist Jenny Holzer warned. Who's she? Let's actually, I'm wondering if we can get a little more context on this quote. Try it in quotes. From Interview Magazine. Oh shit, in 1977? Is that? Hold on. In 1977, she began an ongoing series of truisms. Deviants are sacrificed to increase group solidarity. Money creates taste. Don't run people's lives for them. Romantic love was invented to manipulate women. So she's this, like... Is it wrong that I just assumed that if she was a feminist, or sorry, a woman writing in the 70s about like truisms and things like this, that she probably was some kind of feminist? I've just sort of assumed that. Yeah, I think it is wrong. I mean, it doesn't seem like they're making any kind of Let me just real quick. Yeah, it doesn't seem like she's a feminist at all, actually. I mean, I'm sure she's feminist, you know what I mean? She's not known as a feminist. But yes, this is from a series of truisms she put together in 1977. So yeah, so this is very, very much restating the Vampire Castle article we just, argument that we just sort of went through. So I'm not going to waste too much time going over it. But basically her point here is that, the left has this sort of rise with Bernie Sanders' primary campaign that builds all this momentum and energy and brings all these people together. But then Bernie Sanders loses. Hillary Clinton becomes, the standard bearer of the entire left, even though the actual left never cared for her. But she becomes the icon of, not rightism. And that, in that sort of mismatch where you take all of this Sanders energy and then sort of it crashes up against the walls of the Clinton campaign, you end with this sort of like eating your own young, sort of very Vampire Castle-y situation where everyone is just sort of like, has all this anger. Also, you gotta also just bring into the fact that this sort of Trump's bilious, whatever she said, that like the glittering bilious spectacle of Trumpism is just so enraging that everyone is looking for something to do. But, the left has no institutions capable of actually, getting the goods, to borrow a term she's going to lean heavily on later. Actually materially achieving anything. And so we can smack only those within arm's reach ourselves. And then also this seems like a valid point too, that it partially in response to that, in response to this really terrifying other, there's this desire to sort of look inwards and try to perfect your own movement and sacrifice deviance in the name of group solidarity and strength. So Marxist writer David Harvey notes that even Warren Buffett acknowledges the neoliberal era is marked by a one-sided class war waged only by the capitalists. And then the Buffett quote, "Sure, there is a class war, and it is my class, the rich, who are making it, and we are winning." I'm curious where David Harvey come in. She could just quote Warren Buffett directly. Who's this David Harvey guy? I'm probably going to have to do a little more than that, huh? Reading Marxist Capital, David Harvey. So he's like 84, British-born Marxist economic geographer and distinguished professor of anthropology and geography, graduate center of the City University of New York. So he works at SUNY these days, so in America. Okay, I don't know. I feel like she just wanted to like put his name in there as like a little breadcrumb, like, ooh, go look up this guy. Because I feel like it was just he quoted Warren Buffett, and now she's quoting him, quoting Warren Buffett. Whatever. The left lies sputtering on the mat, unable to maintain its ground, much less make any material gains. It's hard to disagree when our gestures lack bite and our political parties, and most of our unions, are feckless at best and capitalist quislings at worst. Let me read that again. It's hard to disagree when our gestures lack bite and our political parties, and most of our unions, are feckless at best and capitalist quislings at worst. Whether it takes the form of insular campus activism, reactionary internet sermonizing, or impotent calls for general action, what passes for the left today is both parochial and completely disconnected from power. To put it bluntly, we have lost, we are decimated, and we are feeble. What's worse, we refuse to admit our failures, repeating them over and over again, castigating anyone who might question this pattern. In exiting the Vampire Castle, Fisher alerted to us to a witch-hunting moralism. In this case, against anyone who might try to raise class consciousness, a witch-hunting moralism, in this case, against anyone who might try to raise class consciousness, that inevitably devolves into guilt and ineffectuality. In the wake of the election, it's a lesson that seems to have gone largely unlearned by a self-sabotaging left. All right, so that's section 1 here, and then we're going to start getting into a little bit more of the union and activism stuff. But let me just pop over here and try to summarize what we have just learned. So basically her argument is that the left, she argues that the left has become weak and impotent because we have no powerful institutions through which to work, and because of that lack, we focus on purifying our ranks internally instead, leading us to cut off our noses to try to make our faces prettier, or something like that. All right, is that a fair summary of what you just said, Sherry? The left has become weak and impotent because no powerful institutions through which to work. Because of that lack, we focus on purifying our ranks internally instead. You know, it's not because we have no, because I gotta go, why don't we have powerful institutions? Because instead of focusing on class consciousness and creating powerful institutions which can actually affect real material change. So yeah, the left has become weak and impotent because instead of focusing on class consciousness and creating powerful institutions which can actually affect real material change, we focus on purifying our ranks internally, leading us to cut off our noses to try to make our faces prettier, or something like that. Yeah, that works for me as a decent summary of the intro there. So now we move on to section 2, Scabs and Flirts. I was introduced to the idea of a woman's strike while speaking on a panel of leftist feminists shortly after Trump was elected. During the Q&A afterwards, a feminist from the audience took the microphone and delivered an impassioned speech. Among the things participants were to abstain from were paid jobs, emotional labor, childcare, diapers, housework, cooking, sweeping, laundry, dishes, errands, groceries, fake smiles, flirting, makeup, laundry, and shaving. At the end of her speech, I jokingly asked if I was allowed to flirt with other women during the strike, or if that would be scabbing. I did not get a laugh. Of course, tensions were high and good humor was in short supply, but there was also something genuinely irksome about the perceived usefulness of such a strike, and my glibness betrayed my skepticism. For one, general strikes require a massive amount of organizing, and the proposed date for the strike was a few short months away. Also, the National Planning Committee was much heavier on academics and writers than on labor organizers. And if the turnout was low, would anyone even notice? If a tree strikes in the woods where no boss is there to feel it, can the tree really get the goods? These questions were frustratingly overshadowed by criticisms from liberals insisting that only the privileged women would be striking. This framing, of course, misses the point. The success of a strike is not dependent on the relative privilege of the workers participating, but in the chaos those workers can inflict by withholding their labor. So she's talking about, I think this is a thing that actually happened, right? The women's strike. This was like a real thing. And is, you know, kind of proving her point here, right? That I don't like remember it as some iconic thing. But yeah, women's strike for equality. This was a thing. August 26th. What year are we in here? 1970, okay. Celebrated the 50th anniversary of passing the 19th Amendment. So first of all, not a new idea exactly. Was there not I guess the Wikipedia article, maybe the International Women's Strike? This is the new one. Yeah. So this is 8th of March 2017 is when it happened. And this was the International Women's Strike. I remember seeing pictures of marches from all over the world. I mean, I think it's fair to sort of look back and say that it did not really lead to major, like, pro-woman changes in culture or, politics. However, I think it's also worth seeing it in the context. I mean, like, when did the New York Times Harvey Weinstein piece come out? This isn't the original one, right? No, this is. Okay, so October 5th, 2017. And then we're talking here March 2018. So we're kind of in the, if we're talking March 2018, we're 6 months, 5 months into Me Too at that point, and we're sort of, that feels like, in my memory of it, kind of the peak of that whole sort of era of Me Too and again, the kind of response to the grab him by the pussy president. So I think it's a little harsh to say, oh, well, the women's strike did nothing, right? Like, look, women aren't, equal now, or whatever you want to say. So clearly the women's strike was a total failure. I think it can be seen as a part of this sort of broader, feminist movement, I guess would be the way to put it. But, I mean, yeah, it does seem like Amber's skepticism was, aged well, I guess you'd say. So, yeah, I read this one and we're down here. Okay. Striking works because it fucks up someone's day. But whose day would the participants of the women's strike affect? Would the event, billed as a day without women, amount to anything more than a day without adjuncts and freelance graphic designers? As an adjunct myself, I believe my job is important, but if I'm being perfectly honest, no one notices when I don't show up for one day of work. It costs no money, and it doesn't plunge the university into chaos, and without cost or chaos, a strike is an impotent performance. In my little lefty circles, these concerns were not received graciously. Men who questioned the strike's utility were branded sexist. Women who did the same were simply ignored. It was reminiscent of the Hillary campaign's rhetoric. Sorry, read that terribly. Women who did the same were simply ignored. It was reminiscent of the Hillary campaign's rhetoric. Every feminist who didn't fall in line was suddenly invisible. Every man with a criticism of a woman was suddenly manifesting a deep-seated and pathological misogyny. When I asked my more enthusiastic comrades why I should be striking, or what I would even be striking for, the best answer I got was, why not? We're just trying to see what sticks. The worst I got was silence. There were a lot of passive-aggressive Facebook manifestos about how lefties who questioned the action were just scared, or closet liberals, or worse, scabs. So what you're saying here is basically, strikes are meant to do something, right? That a strike is aimed at getting the goods, at getting management to concede to some kind of desire. And it works because it fucks up someone's day. It costs something or creates chaos and basically reminds management that, they need the workers just as much as the workers need them, and that, that they better give them a fair deal. And that the women's strike, again, who would a woman's strike affect? Who would be sitting here going like, oh, damn, I forgot. I really do need women to do my thing. And I mean, what's interesting, I think the thing that's missing here is her point isn't so much that, like, if all women went on strike, it wouldn't fuck up someone's day, right? Her point is that these particular women who were going to go on strike weren't, all women in society. Because as I was saying that sentence a second ago, I was like, well, if all women stopped showing up for their, just like stayed in bed all day, yeah, lots of people's day would get fucked up. But her point here is that it's just going to be like adjuncts and freelance graphic designers who are like taking a day off, basically. And that it would, not only would it like, not accomplish anything, but also sort of like undersell the power that women actually have. A strike is a powerful thing, and that, as I was saying, it reminds management that the workers are important and need to be listened to. It is an inspiring thing that reminds everyone how powerful they are. And if like 1% of women strike, it has the opposite effect. It's like, oh, that's a day without women? Oh, that was like fine, nothing. Oh, okay, yeah. So fuck all the shit they're asking for. So yeah, and then she, when's this from again? June 2017. So yeah, you gotta go back to the 20s. I feel like we're still in an era where every argument has to sort of like revert on some level to the Trump-Clinton campaigns. So yeah, I don't know. That feels like just sort of an of the moment thing. As early as January, many leftists expressed skepticism about calls for a general strike. But by March, there was a self-justifying urgency to defend the tactic against all doubts. Maybe it was due to the reorienting of the action as a women's strike. No one wants to be called a brocialist or a mansplainer. But I think the bigger culprit was in our general panic. We are living in an era of post-Trump hysteria. It's scary out there, and so we cling to the delusion that what we are doing is working. The naysayers, the thinking goes, must be politically backward or reactionary. We should be quick to root them out. Meanwhile, the world goes on. In the end, I called off my classes. I told myself I was setting an example for my students, but I still put women's strike in quotation marks when I explained why class was canceled. I told myself the students were critical thinkers and it would do them good to see a politically active teacher, but really, I canceled class for the same reason I do so many fruitless and potentially self-destructive things, so that no one can call me a coward. In the meantime, I peaked at the rally. It was small by New York standards. Weeks later, I still saw colleagues and comrades defending the action as radical. Some were denouncing those who considered the strike a failure, even those who went on strike themselves, as insufficiently supportive of this promising new vanguard of women college professors. I mean, this is very Vampire Castle language here, right? This sort of like, specifically, I did it so that no one could call me a coward, because I wanted to avoid that guilt. The guilt of not being the hipster, or the academic pedant, or the, what was the third one? The priest, the excommunicating priest, like wanting to avoid all that shit. She sort of goes along begrudgingly, but not enthusiastically, right? Which feels like such a familiar thing. Feels like such a familiar thing in my experience of like not participating in politics, or choosing to or not to. Is it so much comes down to this guilt based on the Vampire Castle. The pervasive mood reminded me of church, and specifically the churches of my grandparents, who cycled through about 100 tiny Protestant evangelical sects, each one seething with mistrust of its own parishioners. Belief in those denominations was fervent, and turnover was high. I grew up with a certain envy of Catholics and Jews, who were allowed to attend services regardless of their connection to God. Oh, yeah, as in, like, you go even if you don't believe in God, because it's just, about going. Whereas in her churches, belief was fervent. For these evangelical Protestants, however, a loss of faith was considered a personal failing, and any hint of creeping atheism could get you purged, lest you infect the brethren with your demonic skepticism. The arbitrary piety was there, too. During the strike, I remembered why my papa tried to sell a car to my mother. I remembered when my papa tried to sell a car to my mother, but then refused to accept her check on a Sunday since he couldn't do business on the Sabbath. That event, like the women's strike, was a strangely unmaterialist initiative, one underwritten by the idea that we should abstain from work merely out of observance and reverence, and not to get the goods. So I think she's kind of established. Is there? Yeah, okay. I want to do another round of notes, and then we'll finish off this section here. Actually, you know what? Yeah, I want to do another set of notes, and then we'll finish off this section here. So she's sort of established this second major theme here, which is that striking is about getting the goods, right? That strikes and political action, and strikes. She complains about the women's strike, which she saw as mostly a pat on the back from people who felt like they had to do something. And that was allowed to go on because nobody felt safe questioning it or criticizing it due to the Vampire Castle. I don't need to reference that there. No one felt safe for criticizing it lest they be purged as unbelievers. Strikes, in her estimation, are about getting the goods. Fucking up someone's day to remind them that they need to treat you better. And a woman, and a poorly attended and not haphazardly, but just like urgently, quickly, sparsely, like scantily, yeah, I'm just gonna go with scantily organized, no, slipshod, roughshod, haphazard, scantily organized strike like the women's strike can't do that. She complains that the women's strike, which she saw mostly as a pat on the back from people who felt like they had to do something, and that was allowed. She complains about the women's strike, which she saw, and it was allowed to go on because nobody felt safe questioning or criticizing it, lest they be purged as unbelievers. Strikes, in her estimation, are about getting the goods, fucking up someone's day to remind them they need to treat you better, and a poorly attended and scantily organized strike like the women's strike can't do that. Yeah, okay. I still flirted that day. I've never understood this tactic of chastity. But then again, I've always viewed sex and romance as properly proletarian pursuits. It never felt like work to me, but maybe I've been doing it wrong. I also did my dishes. God might not want you to be prurient or fastidious on the day of rest, but capitalism doesn't actually give a shit about your unpaid emotional labor. It's kind of a bro like that. So, at first I felt like this paragraph was kind of just like, making her seem like hip and cool and like, I'm one of you guys. But I feel like she's actually making this point here that is a really good one, which is that like, this sort of shit, her papa, not papa. I just feel like there needs to be another W there if it's gonna be papa. Her papa, not taking a check from his wife on the Sabbath because he's not supposed to do business. That sort of like performative holiness. What did she call it? She's some sort of piety. She used the word piety somewhere. Arbitrary piety. That arbitrary piety of like, I'm not gonna flirt. I'm not gonna do my dishes. Things that don't materially affect someone else. Don't actually fuck up someone's day or cause chaos. Don't actually affect the turning of the wheels of capitalism. Because capitalism doesn't actually give a shit about your unpaid emotional labor. It's kind of a bro like that. What the women's strike did reveal is that the self-appointed Trump resistance is stuck in a compulsive loop, perseverating on symptoms and self-help rather than tackling the disease. The battles you see making headlines in our claustrophobic community have become microscopically petty. Who speaks at what campus? Who made what problematic joke? Which left magazine has a bad take? And who will take responsibility? None of these squabbles are politics. None of them build power. I'm sorry to say, even punching the odd Nazi doesn't build power. It raises spirits, but little else. We're forever resting on the laurels of feel-good symbolic outcry rather than the material victories that make our day-to-day lives better. It suits the ruling class just fine. I'm going to actually just put this whole paragraph right here in the notes because I feel like that is very much the thesis of the article right there. The women's strike did reveal is that the self-appointed Trump resistance is stuck in a compulsive loop, perseverating on symptoms and self-help rather than tackling the disease. The battles you see making headlines in our claustrophobic community have become microscopically petty. Who speaks at what campus? Who made what problematic joke? Which left magazine has a bad take and who will take responsibility? None of these squabbles are politics. None of them build power. I'm sorry to say, even punching the odd Nazi doesn't build power. It raises spirits, but little else. We're forever resting on the laurels of feel-good symbolic outcry rather than the material victories that make our day-to-day lives better. It suits the ruling class just fine. Here we go. We've got an excerpt from Capitalist Realism Is There No Alternative, the book that Fisher wrote that we were talking about earlier. In his 2009 barn burner, Capitalist Realism Is There No Alternative, Fisher diagnosed this rut as an acceptance of our own political futility. Since the anti-capitalist movement was unable to posit a coherent alternative, since the anti-capitalist movement was unable to posit a coherent alternative political economic model to capitalism, the suspicion was that the actual aim was not to replace capitalism, but to mitigate its worst excesses. And since the form of its activities tended to be the staging of protests rather than political organization, there was a sense that the anti-capitalism movement consisted of making a series of hysterical demands which it didn't expect to be met. So basically what he's saying here is that the critics of anti-capitalists, the critics of capitalism, say that the anti-capitalists don't have a plan, right? They don't have some other world they're imagining that they want to, move towards. They don't have some vision of a better world. They're just, making a series of hysterical demands that they don't expect to be met just because they like complaining, they like feeling like victims, whatever you want to say. But that basically their whole movement is so just sort of silly and superficial that it just can't be taken seriously. These lines come from the second chapter, titled, "What if you held a protest and everyone came?" The women's strike listed in its platform, and then I guess we're changing thoughts there. Lines coming from chapter, "What if you held a protest and everyone came?" The women's strike listed in its platform an end to gender violence, reproductive justice for all, labor rights, full social provisioning, and environmental justice for all. If those are the expectations of the women's strike, they are the exactly of the kind Fisher describes, the sort you never expect to be met. Conversely, if the platform wasn't listing demands, it was a strike without demands, which means it was not a strike at all, but a rally. Rallies are fine. I'm not suggesting that we retire the rally, but let's remember what political theater actually does and does not accomplish. Marches are for morale, protests are for pathos, but strikes are for getting the goods, and that requires organizing workers. The hub of political power is not academia. It is not the internet. It is not the media or comedy or romance or friendship or art or theory. It's the workplace. And however deviant or unwanted this message may be, there are workers, mostly ignored by the broader left, who are nonetheless transmitting it loud and clear. I kind of want to put quote this in the notes too. Just this part. The hub of political power is not academia, is not the internet, is not the media or comedy or romance or friendship or art or theory. It's the workplace. And however deviant or unwanted this message may be, there are workers, mostly ignored by the broader left, who are nonetheless transmitting it loud and clear. And now she's gonna that's setting up the next section of this piece. Just gonna, throw this in here. Okay. The deft and the militant. It was difficult getting a hold of Bhairavi Desai. She's busy. The New York Taxi Workers Alliance, NTWA, New York Taxi Workers Alliance, is very active, very understaffed, and very underfunded. But it's a force to be reckoned with, even though the majority of its more than 19,000 rank-and-file drivers feel the exacerbated sting of institutionalized racism under Trump. So we're talking about a specific union here, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. On January 27th, Trump issued an executive order crookedly titled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. The Taxi Workers Alliance was administering an exam for a driving class at the time, and around 40 members were gathered in the office, alarmed by what they immediately recognized as a Muslim ban. Phone calls poured in. Drivers were angry and scared. They turned to their union first. The next day, the union tweeted, "No pickups at JFK Airport 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. today. Drivers stand in solidarity with thousands protesting inhumane and unconstitutional Muslim ban." With a useful tweet, uncharacteristic of the medium, the strike went public. Let me just keep going. I think she's going to explain what she means here. I don't need to restate it. The anti-ban rally at JFK was a big story, and with good reason. It was an uplifting sight. Somewhat underreported, though, was the labor action that helped stir the beautiful chaos. Any New Yorker will tell you getting to or from an airport is an absolute nightmare. Taxis are essential. In less than 24 hours, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance threw a fat wrench in the daily functioning of an international airport, marooning travelers in a rapidly expanding and unruly crowd. Off-duty drivers even showed up to hold down the lot. Uber tried to scab, of course, but everyone saw through it, and a mass of customers deleted their app in response. It was only an hour, but an hour was all it took. The protest combined with a taxi strike is what broke JFK. So yeah, JFK, Muslim ban rally. I just want a quick refresher Yeah, the protest against Executive Order 13769, also referred to as the protest against Donald Trump's travel ban or protest against Trump's Muslim ban. Thousands of people gathered at various airports in the United States and around the world to prevent the returning of refugees and other visitors from 7 countries considered unsafe. According to various sources, more than 2,000 people were at the protest at JFK International in Queens, with other protests appearing at significant international airports and other important sites around the United States. Protests continued daily and internationally through February 6th. They also continued after a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order against parts of the travel ban. So yeah, I was just hoping for some pictures really, but yeah, we got, all these people showing up at JFK protesting the Muslim ban order, and mainly in the, pursuit of preventing refugees from being sent back to their countries. So they really crowded the airport up. And so not only to have all these people gumming up the works, but then also the New York Taxi Workers Alliance said, yeah, we're not doing pickups at the airport and we're just going to totally shut the motherfucker down, basically. Though the protests got the brightest spotlight, the taxi workers did get plenty of attention on social media that night. When I asked Desai if she was shocked by the protest, she said, "We were so caught up in the protest we didn't think anybody knew. It wasn't until we got home late that night, after we had lost our voices, that we knew people were talking about it. We were blown away." Desai was shocked because NYTWA members are used to working unnoticed, even when they win, and they do, and even when they fight hard, which they always do. Still, it should surprise no one that they've shut down the airport before. In September 2015, a driver was assaulted by a dispatcher, and the union staged a sit-down. The Port Authority came with dogs, but the drivers refused to get up or move their cars, saying, "We move when the union tells us to move." I just want a little background on that. September 2015, NYTWA, sit in JFK. Well, we're going to get the 28. Yeah, we're going to get that big one. Let's put a word assault in there. Damn, I want the old one. The old one seems to be totally eclipsed by the new one. I can't find any reference to this earlier thing. I guess I'm gonna trust her that it happened. Are there any other details I could put in there to try to find this thing? Drivers assaulted, union stage a sit-in, Port Authority. Let's try putting Port Authority in there. Okay, well, this one did not get a lot of attention, as she says. I mean, it's funny because that was the point, right? NYTWA members are used to working unnoticed, and apparently the internet is I'm sure if I knew, like, the right thing to search, I could find reference to this thing, but it does seem to have gone largely unnoticed here. And again, we move when the union tells us to move. If that doesn't, send a fucking chill down your spine and make you want to go, fuck yeah. You're on the wrong side of history, man. So, on paper, the NYTWA looks like it's poised to be devoured by neoliberalism. After a mere 2 years of organizing, it was officially formed in 1998, a younger union born under the Clinton administration, which was hardly a golden era for organized labor. And 19,000 drivers may sound like a large membership, but compared to the big unions, it's a blip. What's more, NYTWA members had been vulnerable workers even before Trump. For one thing, none of the drivers are legally classified as employees, making the NYTWA the only non-employee union with an AFL-CIO charter since the United Farm Workers of the 1960s. Without employee status, they aren't guaranteed employee rights, nor was the charter a windfall for the NYTWA. It was only supposed to protect them from other larger unions that might try to poach their drivers. Unfortunately, the charter raised the taxi workers' profile, and they've experienced even more interference from other unions since. One incident of a competing union organizing on their turf completely derailed a campaign in a large metropolitan area. However, Desai asked that I not name names so as not to exacerbate tensions between the two organizations. Add to this the rise of the sharing economy. Not only do service apps like Uber spend millions to fight labor regulation, but Uber itself has run an attack campaign against the NYTWA, going so far as to send their drivers misinformation about the union thugs who might try to woo them. Meanwhile, other unions have cozied up to Silicon Valley by throwing their principles out the window. The Machinist Union struck a deal to form the Independent Drivers Guild, a pseudo-union that is in fact unilaterally operated by Uber itself. Despite all of this, the NYTWA is vibrant and growing. Where others see walls, Desai sees challenges. We fret over the rise of the millennial precariat, but the non-employee status of the drivers did not faze Desai. Organizers have to be creative, she said. They are fighting Uber's propaganda with their own information campaign, and they're watching their backs, guarding against raids from other short-sighted opportunistic unions. Most impressively, they flex labor muscle against state power, which is now firmly in the hands of the right. It's true that it was inspiring to see so many people standing against racism at an airport, which is essentially purgatory with Starbucks and duty-free booze. But what about the deft and militant saboteurs who monkey-wrenched everyone's ride home? Watching the live feeds, my head was spinning. The world was filled with promise again. We can still shut down ports. What else can we do? So yeah, let me just pop in another note here. So she contrasts the women's strike with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance strike at JFK Airport during the protests against Trump Muslim ban, which basically shut down the airport. I mean, does she talk about what goods they got specifically? I know it said that a judge later went on to rule the thing, put a stay on it, and it's still being challenged, right? I think it still just keeps getting batted around from court to court. And one court will say it's unconstitutional, another court will say it can keep going. It still hasn't really been decided on. I mean, it seems like basically all they achieved here was shutting down JFK Airport and pissing people off. But what goods did they? Her whole point is strikes are about getting the goods. What goods did they get? Okay, yeah, we're almost at the end of this article. I'm just going to finish this note, then finish the article and see if she clears that up at all. Let's just see what the status is currently of Trump's Muslim ban. So yeah, Executive Order 13769. Except for the extent to which it was blocked by various courts, which is kind of what I want to know about. It was in effect from January 2017 until March 16, 2017, when it was superseded by Executive Order 13780. Lowered the number of U.S. refugees to be admitted into the United States to 50,000, suspended the refugee admission program for 120 days, suspended the entry of Syrian refugees indefinitely, directed some cabinet secretaries to suspend entry for those whose countries do not meet adjudication standards under immigration law for 90 days, and included exceptions on a case-by-case basis. Homeland Security lists these countries as Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. More than 700 travelers were detained, and up to 60,000 visas were provisionally revoked. The signing was provoked widespread condemnation and protest, resulted in a legal intervention against the enforcement of the order. Some calling it a Muslim ban because Trump had previously called for temporarily banning Muslims after the San Bernardino terrorist attack. And a nationwide temporary restraining order was issued on February 3rd, 2017 in the case Washington versus Trump, which is upheld. Okay, yeah, so it was a temporary restraining order was issued in February in Washington versus Trump, upheld by the Court of Appeals of the Ninth Circuit, and then DHS stopped enforcing it. Okay, so I guess I was a little bit wrong, and it has pretty much been, withdrawn, and then Executive Order 13780 takes its place. And on June 26, 2018, the Supreme Court upheld the third executive order, Presidential Proclamation 9645, and its accompanying travel ban in a 5-4 decision, with the majority opinion being written by Chief Justice Roberts. Let's go back over to these protests and see if we can get, like, domestic political reaction. Yeah, like an actual goods that was gotten is kind of what I'm looking for here. And just scanning this, I mean, it seems like we got a lot of politicians coming out, in favor of it, in favor of the protests, supporting the protesters, including Sonia Sotomayor, who wrote a dissent. Okay, so, I mean, it seems like it's a little strong to say that protest really got the goods, but it's also... It does fit with her broader point that, like, a union of workers can shut down a port and can cause all sorts of chaos and can create, the women's strike. What if you compare the two, you do still have to say that the taxi worker strike, like, had a much bigger impact than the women's strike. So I guess the point here is not so much that, because they shut down the airport, they suddenly got everything they wanted, but which basically shut down the airport and hugely galvanized public opinion and forced politicians and courts to take seriously, to mount, to seriously oppose, I'm trying to trust the Muslim ban. And then I'll just put in parentheses, even though Supreme Court eventually upheld a follow-up order which replaced it. Okay, let's close this article out here. A more perfect union. I've spent a lot of time trying to find a novel way of delivering this very cold take. But there's just nothing new about the one and only prescription for socialism, however aberrant it sounds. More than Twitter-style rhetoric, amputated strikes, and academic posturing, the left needs radical militant unions with a political vision beyond the protection of their own rank and file. When the Muslim ban was declared, the drivers of the NYTWA immediately turned to their union because they know it's how they fight. That's what unions need to be. And I just want to pull this quote too, because I feel like that's another like major takeaway for me from this article. I mean, it's specifically this line: when the Muslim ban was declared, the drivers of the NYTWA immediately turned to their union because they know that's how they fight. And that's what union need to be. And then sort of more broadly here, she's calling for a grander vision of unions, right? That more than Twitter-style rhetoric, amputated strikes, and academic posturing, the left needs radical militant unions with a political vision beyond the protection of their rank and file. Political vision beyond the protection of their own rank and file. We need to be able to build labor coalitions and strike for real, meaning we can shut everything down until our demands are met. Sometimes this will be illegal. Sometimes workers will have to camp out and occupy workplaces. Sometimes they will have to sabotage machinery or bully the boss. Maybe there are gains to be had in local elections, but even as Bernie Sanders is currently the most popular politician, the Democrats still seem hell-bent on fighting winners and running losers. If we're ever going to have any sway in electoral politics, we need union muscle. For his part, the Marxist NYU professor, writer, and sociologist Vivek Chibber put it nicely in Why We Still Talk About the Working Class. The working class is unlike any other social grouping in the non-capitalist section of modern society. However penurious it is, however dominated it is, however atomized it is the goose that lays the golden egg. It is the source of profits because unless workers show up to do their work every day and create profits for their employers, that principle of profit maximization cannot be carried out. It remains a dead letter. I think penurious, it's got something to do with money. I want to say it's like cheap, but okay, poor. Extremely poor, poverty-stricken. So yeah, however poor they are, however dominant they are, however atomized they are the ones who make the profits. And, capitalism cannot function without them. It's true that many traditional labor unions are backward or weak. Some will need an overhaul. After a notoriously failed strike effort, the communications workers of America cleaned house, replaced an incompetent leadership, assessed their failure, and regrouped. And then that led to a successful strike against Verizon in 2016, one that yielded 1,300 new jobs and a 10.5% raise over 4 years. Other unions, like the aforementioned machinists, must be gutted entirely, their membership reorganized into new institutions. Mostly, though, we need to start organizing the unorganized, i.e. most workers, and focus heavily on strategic points of employment. As much as it would flatter my ego to believe otherwise, I am not at a particularly strategic point. I'm an adjunct professor at a private university, and even when we all strike, it's only a problem for our little university microcosm. But take heart, fellow atomized and expendable neoliberal subjects. There is a place for us in the coming wars. The microcosms still need to be organized, every bit helps, and established unions can be refreshed and steered towards radical ends. Nevertheless, I regret to inform you that much of this endeavor will be quite dull. Organizing is not usually as invigorating as rallying. It's mostly meetings, planning, phone calls, emails, spreadsheets. Women's work. There are a lot of tedious administrative tasks that go into forming and maintaining a union, and the work is rarely as romantic or cinematic as a bunch of taxi drivers locking down JFK. But those moments do happen. They're sustaining, and they compound one another. Only labor can make it happen. Only workers can shut down production. Only workers can close the ports, and only workers can take capital hostage and make the whole world stand still. So she gets a little, I don't know, I always hate the part of like every documentary or article where they're like, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna do that, and we're gonna do this. As a like deeply materialist person, which is, this is a very materialist argument right here, right? That workers have this power of producing capital, and the capitalists depend on them, and it is generally a very materialist argument here. But like my attitude on these things is like, okay, but like just writing, to her point, like her point is writing an article with a rousing conclusion is not going to be the revolution, right? And so like just the sort of the rousing conclusion of the article kind of like, goes against the whole message of the piece. But we'll forgive her that because, we're humans and we need the little uptick at the end. You just you have to do that. You got to put in the little thing at the end where it's like, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. So anyways, I think there's a light irony there to her writing this whole thing and then doing the opposite. But yeah, so I don't know. The one thing I heard it said the other day that there's a pretty solid correlation between the decline in union membership and the sort of stagnant wages of the middle class. I just wanted to get a graph of union membership in U.S. historical. Yeah, that'll do. From the Bureau of Labor Statistics, can we get like a... Well, so this goes to 1983. Can we go a little earlier than that? No, this is just the last, because like that so the famous graph. I should probably put the word graph in there, huh? Is versus productivity. That's the one you got to do, right? Yeah. Well, here it is, anyways. So hard to get like an image big these days. But yeah, so up until 1973, like productivity and wages kind of increase in tandem with each other, and then something happens in 1973 and hourly compensation flatlines and productivity increases. Now, there is an argument I've heard that this is sort of bullshit because like hourly compensation doesn't take into account the like ballooning health insurance costs that businesses pay, and that if you add that in, they actually line up pretty well. But that's not what we're talking about for right now. What I want to know is, so this is the graph. 1973 is kind of the line where they separate. What I want to know is like, when does the does union membership start declining? Okay, yeah. So here, this is, I don't know where this is from Wikimedia, so it's from some Wikipedia article. Is there a way to get to the, like, originating wiki article from Wikimedia? I guess not, huh? Boy, that seems like a thing. File usage on other wikis? No. File usage on commons? No. Okay, well... yeah, there we go. Labor unions in the U.S., causes of income inequality, causes of unemployment in the United States. That's super dope. Okay, good. I'm glad that exists down here. File usage on other wikis. So yeah, labor unions in the United States. And then presumably it's still there. Yes. Membership. Union membership has been declining in the U.S. since 1954 and since 1967. What? I guess it started, I mean, if we look at this map here, or this graph, it sort of starts going down in 1954, then in 1967, it like, and then in the mid 60s, it kind of has this brief uptick and then starts going down again. And as union membership rates decreased, middle class incomes shrank correspondingly. So yeah, so here we have this graph, right, that does line up pretty well. Where 1970 here, we have this strong drop off of numbers. Union membership in the U.S., and that does line up with that other graph where in 1973 wage is basically stagnant even as productivity keeps increasing at roughly the same rate. And so the argument that sort of inevitably leads you to is that unions are this ridiculously important thing for the power of the working class. And again, I think it really all comes down to this line right here. Where is it? When the Muslim ban was declared, the drivers of the NYTWA immediately turned to their union because they know it's how they fight. That like, if you are just a person, that you sitting there listening to this, like, you read the news and you read like, oh, Trump has announced that he's just gonna shoot every transgender person, in the face in the public square. And you're like, oh God, that's horrible. What can I do about that? And that, presumably there would be some sort of rally, there'd be like a bunch of people would take to the streets and be like, nah, we're not okay with this. And then they'd go home. And then once they go home, Trump starts shooting people in the face. Him personally, in this example, I just want to be clear, he's going around with a gun, just like shooting trans people in the face. But that you feel, maybe you can go to the climate strike if you're really scared about global warming. But like, what did that do? Like that you feel this like, floating in space. There's this very much this floating in space characteristic, and there's just like debris hurtling past you at all points. And honestly, a lot of it like hits you. A lot of the debris hits you, and you're like, ah, shit. I'm floating in space though. What can I do? I can't do anything. I can sort of go like this, but that cancels out. Like if you were just one person floating in space, there's nothing you can do about the constant onslaught of terrible, horrible things in the news. But that what unions can be is, an army, one soldier versus an army, and that they can, be the way that people fight. And that again, with a grander political vision than just the protection of their own rank and file, unions could be the thing that is needed to sort of, balance power between the elite and, the hoi polloi. Is hoi polloi? I can never remember if hoi polloi is elite or non-elite. Hoi polloi. The common people, yeah, okay. Yeah, so like I said at the beginning, this article, and again, this was like 2017. The sort of rough history of my like political leanings, where I was like always very radically like liberal progressive, leading up to and including Bernie Sanders' primary campaign. And then when he lost, I just kind of had this moment where I was just like, fuck it, you know what, who cares, whatever. Let the neoliberals take care of things. Hillary Clinton will be president. Shit'll probably be like, fine, whatever. Everything will just sort of like keep going. Clearly, they've got all the power, whatever. And so I kind of like checked out for a little bit. And then Hillary didn't become president. Trump became president. And I was like, oh shit. I was actually right about all that radical stuff. The neoliberals have no idea what they're doing. They're fucking everything up. And we need some sort of like, like radical movement to actually counterbalance against the horrible systemic oppression that dominates our world. And so this article was, what did we say, June 2017? I keep forgetting. Yeah, June 2017. So this is, 8 or 9 months after I sort of like swung back around. So it was a very big thing to me of defining like, okay, so like, what, before I had very nebulous ideas of like, oh, well, we just need to like rip down everything and, America's an empire doing, I don't know. I feel like this article helped me really dial in on like, the disorganization of, everyone is the problem. And, I don't want to keep rambling for too much longer. I promised myself I would keep this under an hour and a half, and we're bumping up against that. So I don't want to keep ranting too much about my own political development. But basically, I think the major takeaway from this, for me, was that, that unions are what allow us to not be floating in space. That it is the productive power of the worker that is the sort of lever that allows them to move the world. And that, the reason that is why those two things have been demonized and need to be rehabilitated, right? The working class and union membership. I think this concept can be taken beyond just the like labor union, right? And into this idea of like a broader union of people who are, productive, important working people who have that power for that reason. But that like, if we take the real kernel of this as being, that we are just floating in space and we need something to be our spaceship or to grab onto and push against or something, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a labor union. It just needs to be a group of people with whom you can act in concert to feel like you are, number one, part of something, more than just yourself, which is crucially important for the human psyche. But number two, actually able to do something, that you are part of something. I guess it's really the same point, right? That you are part of something more powerful than just your isolated, atomized self. I'm going to go through a lot more articles in the coming days, and we're going to, then we'll get back into doing the actual dailies thing. But I just want to drop that is like a significant animating impulse about the dailies to me, is that like you can just sit and read the news on your own and it's terrifying and horrible and awful, but I want to have a community of people to read it with, even if we don't always necessarily agree about our interpretations on it. I just want to have people there with me doing it, and that when something is, that like the sort of ultimate dream would be that we can get to be a big enough community that when something important happens and we feel like we want to do something, that we are like actually a block that can, move the world a little bit. That is sort of an end game goal for the thing. And it is in large part, I think, can be traced intellectually back to this article right here. So that's why I wanted to start with this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Maybe you fell asleep watching it, which is something I do a lot with YouTube videos, and I would be honored to be that for you. I think this is the perfect medium for falling asleep videos, just an hour and a half dive into like a 2,000 word article. Or maybe you actually learned something and felt enlightened and enjoyed it. I don't know. Gonna be a lot more videos like this coming out over the next couple of weeks. We'll see if I decide to just do like 10 of them and then stop and then go into regular dailies business, or if I want to like keep them going. I don't really know, but I actually really enjoyed recording this. I've been putting it off and dreading it, but it was actually really fun. So I'm looking forward to doing the next one. Hope you guys are looking forward to watching it. I will talk to you then, but until then, have a great life, people. I'll see you later. Take it easy. Goodbye.